Hello and welcome to this month's mini lecture as part of the Huddersfield Textiles Evening School. So I've decided to pick a really big topic to squash into our mini lecture today, and that is cultural appropriation, which is something that increasingly textiles and fashion designers need to be aware of and considerate of. And so it's always something that's occurred within fashion and textiles, but more and more we are collectively trying to move away from it. So the most basic definition of cultural appropriation is the taking of aesthetic or material elements from another culture by someone who is not a member of that culture without giving credit or profit. So even though this states it is a basic definition, it is actually quite difficult in all cases to define cultural appropriation. The definition is often being reshaped and developed, and it can mean slightly different things to slightly different people depending on our own cultural background and our kind of own ethical values. So put more detail on this slide about cultural appropriation, which is taken from a great little article by Green and Kaiser about the discussion of fashion appropriation and cultural insensitivity, which you can find online if you want to find out more. So this is an example of cultural appropriation from fashion, where the brand KTZ has clearly really heavily borrowed from, on the left, the sort of traditional Inuit garment. And that's problematic from many reasons, but one of the big reasons is that the Inuit people have, historically been repressed or excluded from society, and then a kind of white dominant society is then using their culturally significant garments as a fashion statement. So cultural appropriation is not just limited to textiles for fashion. There are lots of examples from interiors, and that's what we're going to look at a little bit today. Beyond textiles, we also see cultural appropriation in film, music, cuisine, art, basically any and all forms of culture. So we're going to have a little look at Navajo weaving. So the Navajo are a Native American people of the southwestern area of what is now known as the United States of America. So the Navajo are really well known for their woven textiles, these kind of geometric patterns, but also they do some quite figurative motifs within their weaving, often using natural fibres such as wool and cotton. And the tribe registered the name Navajo as a trademark in 1943 in order to try and regain control over Navajo weaving as a kind of motif. So Urban Outfitters, unfortunately I can't quite remember the date of this. I think it was in the late 2000s, were using the Navajo name without prior permission, and they were using it for a range of products with this kind of generic geometric pattern on. So the Navajo Nation took Urban Outfitters to court. Eventually, Urban Outfitters settled with the Navajo Nation, and I think the real takeaway is that if a company wants to use the Navajo name, they need to ask for permission before they go about that. So more recently, this is currently on sale in Darnell is this Navajo rug. So I haven't been able to find out whether this is an officially sort of licensed use of the Navajo name, but we still see the Navajo name being utilised in interiors, and I think sometimes there's an issue with the name being used without permission, and also sometimes I feel there's an issue with the kind of genericness of some of the patterns that may be, branded as tribal or Navajo, but aren't truly kind of sourcing back to that inspiration. So another area in cultural appropriation of interiors that we see is the children's teepee. So for the Indigenous peoples of the Great Plains and Canadian prairies, the teepee is really culturally significant and considered a sacred space. So I think especially when motifs or hair structures or patterns are considered sacred in a sort of religious sense, it can be particularly inflammatory for them to be appropriated by other cultures in a sort of less significant way. So there's different elements of teepee that have significance for the people of the Great Plains, and they don't feel that it's appropriate to be used as a play space within Western cultures. So one of the things I think it's important for us as textile designers to start thinking about is, well, one, having an awareness of what cultural appropriation is, and then starting to think about, well, how can I avoid doing that? So this is a great little kind of flow chart from the Fashion Revolution blog from a few years ago. The Fashion Revolution website is great and has lots of resources on it, which allows you to consider your own heritage and whether or not you might be culturally appropriating if you are using something that comes from another culture. And I think one of the things to think about here is not seeing cultural appropriation as something that might shut you down from doing something that you want to do, but as a learning opportunity. So increasingly, we're seeing cultural appropriation being considered from a legal perspective. So we saw that the Navajo people took Urban Outfitters to court, and more we are seeing Indigenous and Native people taking legal action against cultural appropriation. And if you want to know more about that legal side of things, the Cultural Intellectual Property website is super interesting and full of resources. And one of their key concepts is consent, credit, and compensation, which are the 3 C's of cultural appropriation. And finally, here I've included a kind of good practice example of cultural celebration. So this was a collaboration between Louis Vuitton and Zapotec, and the Zapotec Mexican artists. So traditionally, some of our really big high-end luxury fashion labels aren't the greatest for avoiding cultural appropriation. They can be quite guilty of making mistakes there, but I think in this instance, Louis Vuitton has done this project in a very sensitive and sympathetic way. So they collaborated on this series of briefcases. Each design on the briefcase, painted design, represented a deep ancient symbolism. And when you purchased these briefcases and trunks, you're required to make 2 payments, one to Louis Vuitton and one directly to the Zapotec artisans, which meant that people who, if we go back to this idea of consent, credit and compensation. These Apotech artists are getting all of those things from this collaboration.